This is a synopsis of The Merchant of Venice, so a summary of events. It's just the main characters and what happens. There's no in-depth analysis here, but if you're confused about the storyline or who's who, then hopefully this will be of some use to you. We'll start with the characters. So we have Jewish characters and we have Christian characters, and we're organising them by religion because that helps in understanding the play and the events. And we'll start with the Jewish characters, and we're going to put Shylock here first. Shylock is Jewish, he's rich, he's a moneylender, and at this point, you know, these are real negative stereotypes really of Jewish people. And remember that Shakespeare probably wouldn't have met or known any Jewish people, so it's very much a stereotype that of the time that Shylock represents. Shylock charges interest when he lends money, that's important, and that's something that Christians at the time didn't do because it was considered immoral. So we have Shylock, the Jewish moneylender. He's an angry man. He has reason to be angry. We'll cover that later. And he's very, very much disliked by other people. And some may say that he's greedy, although I'll leave you to make up your mind whether or not you think Shylock's greedy. He's a widower, so his wife, Leah, who's mentioned, has died, and he has a daughter. So we'll put his daughter here. Her name's Jessica. Jessica doesn't have a very easy time at home. We see that in the play. Her father likes to keep her locked away, and she actually ends up running off with a Christian, and we'll get to that. She steals her dad's money and jewellery, and she converts to Christianity. So those are the two main characters. There's another main Jewish characters. There's another character called Tubal. He's rich too. He's not a major character, but if you see his name come up, he helps out Shylock with a couple of tasks and actually helps Shylock out with some money at some point. So we'll look at the Christians now. Remember that Shakespeare wrote this play at a time when most of his audience would have been Christian, and the Christians are presented relatively heroically. So we'll start with the Duke. You've got the Duke of Venice. He has ultimate power over his citizens, and he presides over the court case at the end of the play. Next we have Antonio. He's the merchant of the title, so the play is called The Merchant of Venice, and that merchant is Antonio. Best friends with Bassanio, if we put Bassanio here, and these two are best friends. They're totally loyal to each other. They've got a really solid friendship. Now, Antonio has behaved really poorly towards Shylock in the past. This is really important. We will return to this. And the other feature I'd like you to know about Bassanio at this point is that he is terrible with money, and he freely admits that he spends whatever he has, even if it's not his to spend. So Antonio's given him money in the past and he's just frittered it away. Okay, we'll put Portia under these two. Portia is a rich heiress. That means that she's inheriting some money. She lives in Belmont, which is not in Venice, so she's some distance away. And the important thing about Portia at this point is that her father wrote a will which laid out a set of instructions about how she was to find a husband. So anybody wanting to marry Portia had to undertake what is a game really, but in the play it's called a lottery. Anyone who wanted to marry Portia had to choose from 3 caskets, so sort of metal baskets. One was gold, one was silver, one was lead, and we'll come back to that later. But essentially the person who chooses the right casket is allowed to marry Portia, and that's her father's died and she has to stick to this set of instructions. Now we've got Salanio and Salarino. I'm going to put these two together. They're almost always, I think always actually, seen together in the play. Different print editions of the play have different variations on these names. So you might see Salanio, you might see Salarino. I think there's about 4 or 5 different versions, but don't worry too much. they're merchants, they're friendly with Bassanio and Antonio, and they both behave very badly towards Shylock. And Shakespeare uses these two actually to communicate events that we don't see happen in the play. Right, under these two I'm going to put Gratiano. He's another friend of this group. He's a chatterbox, never ever stops talking. We get the impression he's actually a bit annoying with that. Bassanio tells him at one point that he's got to rein it in a bit. Nerissa is Portia's lady-in-waiting, so she's one of Portia's staff, really, I guess, but they're very close friends, and she falls in love with Gratiano, so those two get together. And that concludes our main characters. So we'll move on to events, and the play starts with Antonio feeling depressed, and actually relatively quickly it moves on to Bassanio asking Antonio for some money, and he needs money because he wants to present himself as a suitor to Portia. So he needs this money because you can't just turn up to a rich heiress and as a broke man and say you want to marry her. You have to present yourself as a wealthy suitor. So he wants to open one of Portia's caskets, and he doesn't have any money, so he actually suggests to Antonio that one of the reasons he'd like to marry her is because she's rich. So leave you to think about that. But he asks Antonio for money, and Antonio says that he would help normally, but all of his ships are away at sea, and when they return he'll be a wealthy man, but for the moment he's got no upfront cash to give Bassanio. So Antonio tells Bassanio that he will help him out, and they approach Shylock for a loan. And this is a really important part in the play, because Shylock agrees to lend Antonio the money, so that's 3,000 ducats, but the deal is this: if Antonio has 3 months to pay Shylock back, and if Antonio is late paying it back, Shylock wants a pound of flesh. So the specifics of this agreement are that Shylock will be allowed to cut a pound of flesh from any part of Antonio's body, and that's really not the kind of procedure that you'd survive, especially in those days. I mean, a pound is, in grams, it's about just under 500 grams, I think. You know, we're talking about a bag of sugar. If you think how heavy that is, it's an unpleasant suggestion, but Antonio doesn't think that's ever going to happen because he truly believes his ships are going to return. Now, Bassanio is very worried by this, and he actually urges Antonio not to agree to this and says he'll go without, but Antonio doesn't listen, and they make this deal. So Bassanio goes off to see Portia in Belmont. He takes Gratiano with him, and while he's there he chooses the right casket, and also around that, at the same time, Gratiano and Nerissa get together. Remember, Nerissa is Portia's lady-in-waiting. So the rings that are exchanged at this point are important because the men swear never ever to remove them, and quite a big deal is made of that, and that's important for later in the play. And another side plot, which is also important, especially if you're writing about Shylock or if Shylock comes up in your exam, is that Shylock's servant, a man called Lancelot Gobbo, he actually leaves Shylock at this point to work for Bassanio. And at this point, this is when Jessica runs away. So Jessica escapes from her home with Lorenzo, and I think I might have already mentioned this, but she steals her dad's gold and some jewellery, and in particular she steals this turquoise ring, which Shylock had received as a gift from his dead wife before they were married. So we do feel sympathy for Jessica, despite all of this behaviour, because Shylock, before he goes out that evening, we hear him tell her to lock up the doors and windows. He doesn't want her gazing on Christian fools with painted faces, and there's a very strong sense that she's locked away, but at the same time she steals. So there's quite mixed feelings in the audience at this point, and if you want to know where we're up to, that all happens in Act 2, Scene 5. So moving on, we learn that when Shylock has learned of discovered that Jessica's run away, there's a scene with Salanio and Salarino where they are standing around on the street, and they're chatting about Jessica's escape. And the important part of this is that they're really mocking Shylock. So they're calling him names. They call him the Dog Jew. Dog is something that comes up quite a lot as a name in the play for Shylock, and cur, which is kind of a wild dog. And we learn from these two men who are just standing in the street chatting that Shylock has gone crazy. He's basically become so enraged that his language has become all confused and jumbled up. And there's quite a lot of innuendo here. You know, they talk about Shylock shouting about his 2 sealed bags of ducats and his daughter, and there's a suggestion that he's got himself in such a muddle, and they're hinting really that he's talking about his testicles at this point. There's also a clear indication that the men think that Shylock cared more for his money than his daughter. So I'll put some quotations up on the screen so you can see that. We also learn in this conversation that of rumours that Antonio's ships have sunk, or at least one of his ships has sunk. Okay, there's another scene shortly after this. So in Act 3, Scene 1, again, Salanio and Salarino are talking in the street about how Antonio's ships have sunk. And this time, so Shylock comes in, and he's not happy about Salarino's part in his daughter's escape. And the conversation between the men moves on to the pound of flesh, and Salarino asks Shylock, it's probably quite a reasonable question actually, but he asks Shylock what on earth he wants a pound of human flesh for. And this is where we hear Shylock's powerful speech, "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" And this is an important speech for many reasons, and Shylock is also making explicit one of the clear moral messages that we get from this play. You know, we're all humans underneath, and you know, Shylock's unhappy with the way that he's treated. Okay, now Antonio's been arrested, so he's walking around with his jailer, something that probably wouldn't happen in this day and age, but he bumps into Shylock in the street, and they have the conversation where Antonio begs for his life. Well, he certainly begs for the chance to speak, and Shylock says, "No, he says, I'll have my bond. I will not hear thee speak." He says, "I'll not be made a soft and dull-eyed fool." He says, "I'll have no speaking, I will have my bond." So Shylock's, at this point, is sticking to the agreement. Another really powerful part of this scene is Shylock's comment, "Since I'm a dog, beware my fangs." So he's saying, you know, if you're going to treat me like a dog or call me a dog or a cur, then I'll behave like one. We've learned at other points in the play that Antonio has spat on Shylock. You know, he's phlegmed on him really. He's and kicked him and treated him very, very poorly. And Shylock saying this, you know, "Since I'm a dog, beware my fangs," is an interesting quotation to consider, especially if you're writing about Shylock and perhaps the reasons for his behaviour. Okay, so the Duke, you might be wondering why the Duke doesn't stop all of this. The reason the Duke doesn't stop all of this is because he can't just break laws because he likes Antonio more than he likes Shylock. If the Duke chose to save Antonio, then the other laws or bonds in Venice would become worthless, because if they can just be overwritten by the Duke, they're not worth anything. Right, let's move on to Act 4. So there's only 2 scenes in Act 4. In Act 4. So there's Act 4 Scene 1 and Act 4 Scene 2. And Act 4 Scene 1 is the court case, it's the trial. And the Duke starts off by saying that he expects Shylock to show mercy. So it's not a very balanced court case to start with. The Duke refers to Shylock as the Jew, whereas he refers to Antonio as Antonio, calls him by his name. So Shylock isn't given a particularly fair start to this. So the Duke asks him to show mercy, says we all expect a gentle answer due. Shylock refuses, saying no, and that he doesn't need to tell anybody why. And Bassanio steps in and offers Shylock double the money. So Shylock says no, and he actually says if he was offered 6 times the amount, he would still take his pound of flesh. Now, every time you hear Shylock refer to the bond in this scene, or actually in the play, he's referring to the pound of flesh. So the bond means the deal or the agreement, and as Antonio is late with the payment, the bond is the pound of flesh. So Shylock refuses to back down, and Portia comes in at this point, and she's disguised as a male lawyer. You might hear her referred to as a doctor, but it means a doctor of law. So she's meant to be an expert lawyer, and she calls herself Balthazar, so she's dressed as a man. And this is interesting to think about how this would have looked when the play was performed back in the 1600s, because all of the actors would have been male. So you'd have a man dressed as a woman who, for this scene, was then dressed as a man. That happens in a few of Shakespeare's plays. So anyway, we've got a very tense scene at this point. It's really edge of your seat stuff. Portia has been accepted by the court as an authority figure, and she asks Shylock to be merciful, and he refuses, and he asks why he should be merciful, and Portia gives a very, very famous quality of mercy speech, and it's worth committing a line or two of this speech to memory for your exams. It's important, and it's very, very famous, and beautifully written as well. After this speech, we have another reminder to Shylock that he's been offered a huge sum of money, and he again refuses to take the money. And Portia, or Balthazar, as she's called in this scene, says that Shylock may have his pound of flesh. She concludes that the bond is sound. And she actually tells Antonio, you must prepare your bosom for the knife, or for his knife, I think. And she even tells the court to get a pair of scales to weigh the flesh, and for a surgeon to be nearby, and it's getting very close to an execution, really. Antonio makes a final speech, and he ends with a pun that he will pay his debt with all his heart. And Bassanio gives a very heartfelt speech about how much he loves Antonio, and he actually at this point says that he loves Antonio more than his wife. So, and she's, remember, standing in the court dressed as a man, so she says, oh, your wife would give you little thanks for that. So Shylock's being given the go-ahead to cut Antonio's flesh when Portia stops everything. She says soft, that means wait, hold up. And she reminds Shylock that he may take a pound of flesh, but that he cannot spill a drop of blood. And she also says that he's got to take exactly a pound. So not a little bit more, not a little bit less. And if he fails to do this exactly, then he shall be executed and all his goods removed. And this is a really, really critical point in the play, especially for Shylock. It's that he's really put under pressure here, and Portia says, you know, why does the Jew pause? Take thy forfeiture. You know, you've begged for this pound of flesh, you need to take it. And realising that he can't do this, Shylock tries to leave just with the 3,000 ducats, but it's a bit late for that, really. So Portia points out that he's refused that, and that he's insisted on having his bond, so have his bond he must. And Shylock's really, really backed up against a wall here. There's nothing he can do. Portia tells him he has to get on his knees and beg for his life. Gratiano suggests that he's given a halter gratis, which means a free rope, so a free rope so he can hang himself. It's fairly bleak for Shylock at this point. Additionally, Portia points out that he'd conspired to kill a Christian Venetian citizen, so he must lose all of his goods and wealth. The Duke decides that Shylock will not be executed, but half his wealth will go to Antonio and half to the state. That means, you know, to the government. Now Antonio, I suppose you could say he perhaps takes a little bit of mercy on Shylock here, because he allows Shylock to keep his half of the money. So he allows Shylock to keep the money that was due to go to Antonio, as long as Shylock leaves it to his daughter and Lorenzo in his will. So Shylock has to give leave money in his will to the daughter that he's cut off, who's converted to Christianity. So that's going to sting a bit for Shylock. And Shylock is also forced to convert to Christianity. And just take a second to think about Shylock's position here. So he's lost everything. He's lost his wealth, he's lost his religion, his daughter, I suppose his dignity. And that's how the court scene concludes in terms of Shylock and the pound of flesh. Now, having saved Antonio's life, Portia asks Bassanio for his wedding ring as a token of thanks, and Bassanio said he must give Portia, who he thinks is Balthazar, remember, and Portia says she'll have the wedding ring, and this ring was handed to Bassanio with a solemn oath of eternal love, and Bassanio argues and says he can't give the ring over, but essentially he does. And Nerissa, who remember is still dressed as a man, she's also dressed as a doctor of law, or certainly as Portia's helper, she decides that she's going to get Gratiano, her husband, to hand over his wedding ring too, and that's a relatively important side plot. Now, at the very end of the play, in Act 5, all of the Christian characters, bar Shylock, who I suppose at this point would count as a Christian, the others, they all celebrate in Belmont, and the story of the way that Portia and Nerissa saved the day is revealed. It is also revealed that some of Antonio's ships have returned to Venice after all, so for most of the characters this is a real happily ever after ending. Shylock doesn't feature at all in Act 5, so we're left to assume that he remains a broken man. And that is the end of the play. So for themes and for other focus on other scenes, I'm going to make some more of these, but for now that should give you an overview, and if you have any questions about the play,